Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today is episode 3 of my Oscar Best Picture tier list, and I'm going to be discussing every single Best Picture winner from the 70s and 80s. Before we jump into the tier list, as always, I want to say these rankings are based on my personal enjoyment of the films. So, with that out of the way, let's jump into the tier list. Kicking off the 1970s is Patton, which is a 3-hour-long biopic about famous US General George S. Patton and his involvement during World War II. I really enjoyed this biopic mostly because it only focused on his involvement in World War II. I feel like sometimes biopics expand way too far out, try to cover someone's entire life, and it just becomes overly long, too convoluted, or just skips over massive chunks of someone's life. Where I feel like Patton was very condensed and it got to the point of what it was trying to make. I also really enjoyed the battle sequences in this movie. The film featured a lot of vehicles that were actually used during World War II, and some of the recreations and explosions looked fantastic, and it really took you into the heat of the battle, and it really split up some of the slower parts that were more dialogue driven. George C. Scott as Patton was fantastic, and one of my favorite aspects about his character is that they weren't afraid to show the flaws Patton had as a human being. He was very hard-nosed, very old school, and thought everything had to be done his way, and if it wasn't, everything was going to fall apart. And because of that, he was very questionable to some of the younger men and the things they were experiencing on the front lines, and to some of his other commanding officers. And I just really like how this was a just very raw and upfront approach of displaying who Patton was as a human. Because of that, this is definitely one of the better Best Picture biopics I've seen so far, and I'm going to throw Patton at the top of the good category. 1971's The French Connection follows a couple of police officers who are hot on the trail of a French heroin smuggler. Now, I have to say, for a Best Picture winner, I found this story to be quite bland, and I definitely found the characters to be pretty boring. We never really learned too much about the criminals or the two police officers, more than just kind of what they are at a surface level. The two cops are just very dedicated to their job, want to take down this drug operation, and the criminals are just kind of doing their thing, wanting to smuggle in drugs, get their money, and there really isn't too much to the story beyond that. What really stands out in this movie is definitely the chase sequences. There's a fantastic on-foot chase sequence, and then there is one of the best car chase sequences in cinema history in this film. I think a really cool aspect of this movie is it does seem like they used a lot of handheld and kind of like more shaky camera work when filming these action sequences, which really puts you into the scene a little bit more, and that's something I really didn't experience in any Best Picture winner before this one. I do ultimately think William Friedkin's, magnum opus is The Exorcist, and I think that movie is leaps and bounds ahead of this one. But The French Connection is just definitely a fun, smaller cop drama to watch. It's not one that I'm looking to revisit over and over again, but it's definitely worth checking out. I'm going to throw The French Connection at the top of the decent category. Up next is one of the smaller and probably less talked about Best Picture winners, Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather. All jokes aside, I don't know what I can really say about The Godfather that hasn't already been said. I'm guessing it's probably the most watched Best Picture winner of all time. If not, it's definitely up there with probably like Rocky, I would guess would probably be the next one. Or Casablanca maybe, but I think that's getting a little bit too old at this point as well. Anyways, The Godfather is one of the most well-respected movies of all time. Most people call it the greatest film ever made. For me personally, I don't think it's the greatest film ever made, but I really do respect this movie, and I completely understand why so many people put it as their, number one favorite film ever made. The film follows the Corleone family between the 1940s and 50s. They're Italian Americans and they're kind of part of that crime boss underground world, and it just follows everything that happened to them over that time span. Since I don't want to spend too much time talking about this movie because everyone knows how great it is, I want to point out the one thing that I really love about this movie. I know many other people love it for this reason as well, but it's Marlon Brando's performance. Sure, we can talk about every other performer in this movie that is just, top notch. We can talk about the screenplay, which is fantastic. We can talk about Coppola's direction, which is near perfection. but I don't think this movie would be as well regarded as it is if Marlon Brando did not deliver probably one of the greatest performances of all time. To me, it's probably the greatest performance of the 1970s for sure. But, just thinking about it, thinking about those performances that have had an impact on cinema as a whole, Marlon Brando is easily in the top 10, if not top 5, if not number 1. He is the standout in the movie for me, and I could just rewatch all of his scenes over and over again. I am going to put The Godfather at the top of the amazing category. For me personally, I don't like it as much as these two films up here in the masterpiece category, but like I said, I completely understand if this is your favorite movie of all time, but this is where I'm going to slot it currently. 1973 brought us George Roy Hill's The Sting, which finds a small-time crook and a con man teaming up to take down a large crime boss who took down one of their best friends. When it comes to Best Picture winners, this movie is probably mostly well known for being sandwiched between the two Godfather movies, but I was thoroughly surprised and I honestly really enjoyed this film. I think what I really enjoyed about the movie is its setting in the 1930s. Alongside that, they used a lot of filmmaking like elements and tropes from the 30s and 40s as well. There's some really cool transitions and the costumes look fantastic, and I really love Paul Newman and Robert Redford's like back and forth, really quick speaking banter. I think this is just a really cool throwback movie, and I feel like it got better with age, just because it's really interesting watching a movie set in the 1930s that was made in the 70s that's calling back to old filmmaking but is now aged just as much as time from when it was made to when I'm watching it in the present day. I think it gives this really cool, like throwback on throwback aspect. And the story is just super fun as well. I'm always down for a great con man story, and there's a lot of great scenes that kind of relate to that in this movie. I think of the train car sequence where they're kind of stacking cards against the master con man, and then I don't like to dive into too many spoilers because I think everyone should check out most of these films, but the ending of this movie is just top tier fantastic. This movie is just a lot of fun. Sometimes we can see these movies, especially Best Picture winners, feel a little bit more bleak, but this was just a really uplifting, fun, throwback fun time. And I am going to put The Sting at the top of the great category. And 1974 brought us the first sequel to win the award, The Godfather Part 2. Now, I know a lot of people say this is even better than The Godfather Part 1, and some people put this as their number one favorite movie of all time, and I have to say I'm not the biggest fan of this movie. And when I'm saying I'm not the biggest fan, let me just place this movie right now so I can kind of talk about it more freely. I do have it kind of in the middle of the great category here. The film is kind of two different storylines going on at once. One is Vito Corleone and how he became the Godfather that we saw Marlon Brando play in the first movie. And then the separate storyline takes place after the first Godfather film, and that's Michael Corleone kind of taking over the family and following in his father's footsteps. I absolutely love the backstory element of this movie. I think that's 10 out of 10 perfection. It's really interesting kind of seeing the backstory of this character who had such a massive presence in the first movie. When I was watching the first movie, I was just constantly thinking about, wow, I want to learn more about Marlon Brando's, portrayal of Vito Corleone and who that character was, where he came from. And that is fully fleshed out in this movie, and I absolutely love every single second of that. I think I just don't care that much about Michael Corleone's story. Not saying that it's poorly made or poorly acted or anything like that. It's definitely really well made. But for me personally, the final shot of the first Godfather, where we see him looking out through the office door at his wife as the door slowly closes shut, I feel like that leaves such a heavy weight that I don't want to know what comes after it. Everything that comes after it, I'm like, yeah, I completely understood where he was going to go as a person after the final shot in the first movie. So it just felt very predictable to me, honestly. And I was just like, I kind of like the ambiguous element that the first film left us with. So I'm really kind of 50-50 on this movie. And even though that second, like, kind of, um, part of following Michael is very, very well done, very well made. I can't bash it for being, poorly made. I just don't like the idea of it existing just because the ending of the first Godfather left such a heavy impact on me. I felt like this kind of ruined that a little bit, if that makes sense. But nonetheless, it's still a fantastic movie, but it's definitely not up there in the upper echelon for me personally. 1975 kept the great movies coming with Milos Forman's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The movie follows a man who's admitted to a mental institution, and we never truly know if he's crazy or not. But once he's admitted, he befriends most of the people that are there at the hospital, and he kind of teaches them more about life and to rebel against the lead nurse, Miss Ratchet. I've seen a decent handful of Jack Nicholson performances, and I have to say this is my favorite performance from him. He is so endearing, but also flawed in this movie, and he perfectly portrays this kind of messed up, crazy character that's kind of, trying to find his way in life, searching for friendship, and kind of wanting to rebel against the higher power. I think I'd probably describe this movie as a comedic tragedy, which is a type of genre that I don't see, done too well all that often. When you think of comedic tragedy, you instantly think of like really, really old stories like Shakespeare. And this almost kind of is a Shakespearean story in some type of way, where we kind of see a man take on, push against higher power, try to force other people to revolt as he's kind of dealing with his own mental issues. All of the performances in this movie are fantastic. You have Danny DeVito, who is great. Christopher Lloyd is also fantastic, and there's just many, many others. Everyone truly knows their role in this movie, and they play it to perfection. This movie just does not let off the gas from start to finish, and you're fully invested in Jack Nicholson's character, but you also care about all of the other people that are admitted to this wing of the hospital. The ending is definitely an all-timer. Once again, I don't like to spoil things here, but that ending is just so powerful, and you just feel for every single person in this movie. And I think another aspect of this movie that is great is that Nurse Ratchet isn't really a villain. She's portrayed as a villain because Jack Nicholson sees her as one, some of the patients see her as one, but she's just a woman who's trying to keep order and do her job when working with, patients that need that sort of order in their life. So I really like the back and forth that her character brings to the movie as well. This is just a fantastic movie from top to bottom, and I am going to throw One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in the amazing category. Up next is Rocky. Rocky follows an unknown boxer who gets challenged by heavyweight champion Adonis Creed, and his life forever changes once he steps into the ring. I think this movie really excels at being a slower paced character study type of movie. I think the highlight of the film for me personally is Talia Shire. I really enjoyed her as Rocky's, love interest, and I don't think this movie would work as well if she wasn't here or was even dialed back a little bit. I like Sylvester Stallone's performance, but I don't think it's like anything to really write home about. He's just kind of a hard character to connect with. The deepest connection I really felt with him is that he was the underdog, and in these type of sports movies, you just want to root for the underdog. Everyone loves a great underdog story, and Rocky is that. I mean, you have that fantastic training sequence, and just, it all just swells up perfectly to that final, act with the boxing taking place against Adonis Creed. And, just the ending leaves you with that great heartwarming feeling for him. But, as a whole, I don't think Rocky is the easiest character to root for. He's just kind of, a meathead trying to find his way through life. And that's where I really feel like Talia Shire comes into play and really carries, a lot of the emotional weight throughout this film. With that being said, Rocky is hands down one of the most enjoyable sports films of all time. When you just want to like sit down and just put on a movie where you want to root for someone and you just want to feel good inside, Rocky is kind of that quintessential easy watch, and it's just an overall great time. I am going to put Rocky at the back half of the great category. 1977 brought us Woody Allen's Annie Hall. The movie follows New York comedian Alvy Singer and his relationship over multiple years with Annie Hall. I'd never seen this movie before, and going in, I was kind of expecting something along the lines of When Harry Met Sally in 500 Days of Summer from what I heard about the movie. And while it definitely has aspects of those movies throughout, I just didn't ultimately care for the main character in this movie. LV Singer's really kind of a douchey character that never knows what he wants and really just kind of feels like he should own Annie Hall or feels like he should kind of control her, even though he's just clearly a man that has nothing figured out and kind of has almost nothing going for him. The movie does have some great performances throughout. I mean, Woody Allen and Diane Keaton are really fantastic in the movie, and I really enjoyed different aspects of the movie, like the fourth wall breaks. I feel like it was an interesting, curveball to throw into this kind of romantic comedy subgenre, and I feel like this movie probably did pave the way for a lot of the romantic comedies that came after it, like I just mentioned, 500 Days of Summer, When Harry Met Sally, those types of films. It's just a movie I thought I was going to go into and give a 9 out of 10 easily, and ultimately that's not how I feel about it. I still think it's a very watchable movie, and I understand why other people really enjoy this one, but for me, I think this movie's just good, and I'm going to throw it up here in the good category. Up next is The Deer Hunter. The movie follows three friends who enlist in the Vietnam War, and when they return home from the war, their lives are forever changed. This movie has your typical 3-act structure, and I really want to kind of break it down because it's why I don't like this movie. I know this movie is very, very highly acclaimed, and many, many people love this film, but it's just not for me. The first act is pretty much before the boys leave for war, and it mostly takes place in a wedding venue. This goes on for about 45 to 60 minutes, and it is just way too long. We don't learn a whole lot about the characters during this wedding sequence, and there's just nothing really to connect to, there's nothing to grasp onto, and it just drags on and on and on. Act 2 is definitely the highlight of the movie, and that's where the boys go to war and they really experience all the horrific things that are taking place over there. In particular, there's a scene where they're captured and they're forced to play Russian roulette, and that was kind of a white knuckle experience. It was shot perfectly and it built tension to such an immense level, and I was there for it. That scene is fantastic and is just amazing. Then the boys kind of return home from war, and we kind of witness how their lives have changed, how their families and girlfriend lives have changed, and kind of how the war as a whole has impacted society. And then the movie just kind of started to slow down to a crawl again. This film is over 3 hours long, and I think I could easily chop 40 minutes out of this movie, and it would not miss a beat. It's one of those movies that is just overly bloated and just very, very slow for the sake of being slow, and it just doesn't lead to anything. It just left me being bored. It should lead to this like heightened sense of dread as the story moves on, but I just didn't feel that. I felt like the Russian roulette motif was overplayed by the end, where the final act didn't leave that big of an impact on me. And overall, I just kind of found this movie to be disappointing for how, well regarded it is. I don't think it's like awful by any means, but it's definitely just way too slow and has too much fluff, stuck in throughout. I'm going to put The Deer Hunter down in the average category. And we get to end the 1970s with an absolute banger, Kramer versus Kramer. The movie follows a married couple, Ted and Joanna Kramer, and their seemingly perfect relationship. When Ted returns home from work one night, Joanna says she cannot take it anymore and leaves her husband and her son behind. Ted then is forced to kind of juggle his ultra important job with his son as he tries to learn how to become a father and just kind of sort through life. That is ultimately turned on its head when Joanna comes back into their life and wants custody of their son. Dustin Hoffman and Meryl Streep give two of the greatest performances I've ever seen. It is just fantastic from beginning to end, but I have to shout out Justin Henry as the son in this movie. I think that might single-handedly be the greatest child performance I have seen in my entire life. It is just fantastic, and their like three performances fully get you to buy into this very troubled up and down relationship, and the movie honestly just feels too real at some points. I also love how this movie does not tell you how to feel about the husband and wife in this film. I think the movie really leans into the idea that nobody is perfect, everyone has flaws, and people just have, things to work through in life, and sometimes things just don't work out the way you plan them to. And even though I said both of these characters have their flaws, you still feel sympathy for both of these. You understand where they're coming from. And I think that's why this movie just kind of stacks every single scene on top of one another. And it just paints this perfect portrait of a jumbled, messy American family. I don't see dramas that perfectly capture divorce and troubled relationships as well as this movie does. This is a film that I want to revisit multiple times in the future, as it is just so perfectly, written, so perfectly cast. Every aspect of this movie is truly great. I'm very close to putting this movie up in the masterpiece category, but I don't think it's quite there with Casablanca and The Apartment for me yet, but it may get there in the future. But I know for sure I am going to place Kramer versus Kramer at the top of the amazing category. Kicking off the 1980s is Robert Redford's Ordinary People. The movie follows a mother, father, and son dealing with the aftermath of their second son's passing. The son is in therapy because he feels the responsibility for his brother's death. The father is trying to hold the family together, and the mother is constantly reminiscing and favoring the deceased son. This is an extremely well-acted movie that has a script that I mostly enjoy. I really enjoy these family dramas for the most part, but this one did have a few things I didn't care for. I really didn't like how the mother character was handled. It just felt very clunky and awkward. And I feel like you really have to buy into her kind of being angry at her alive son and that she favored her deceased sons over him to really enjoy this film as a whole. Otherwise, it can kind of lead you down a path, like for me personally, where I was just like, what the heck is going on? I really don't buy into this situation as a whole, which then takes me out of the film emotionally, which is, the main aspect of a film like this, is it wants you to be, emotionally invested. I don't have a whole lot to say about this movie. The performances are really, really good. The direction is solid for what the film is, but it's one of those movies where if you don't buy into the story, it's just not going to work for you. And for me, it was just kind of a mixed bag. I am ultimately going to throw this film in the decent category. 1981 brought us Chariots of Fire. The movie follows two British runners that are training for the 1924 Olympics. One is battling with the idea of running on a religious day because he practiced that religion his entire life, and the other one is battling relationship issues because he wants to dedicate his entire life to training for the Olympics. Now, I know I said I didn't have a lot to say about Ordinary People, but I have almost next to nothing to say about Chariots of Fire. It's not bad. The acting is solid, the direction is fine, but the most entertaining aspect about this movie is the opening sequence where there is a group of boys running on the beach and there is a very memorable score playing. If you look up the Chariots of Fire famous score scene on YouTube, you have definitely heard it. It is become, kind of a staple in pop culture and has been used multiple times in other films. But outside of that, this movie is just extremely boring in my opinion. I didn't care about either of the athletes running for the Olympics. I didn't care about the one's relationship issues. I personally didn't care about the other one's religious problems. And if you're not buying into those two aspects, there's nothing here in this movie for you. I would not suggest this movie to anyone unless they are extremely into sports movies, extremely into the Olympics, or they absolutely love, like the two athletes that this movie's based on. If you don't really like those three things, there's nothing here in this movie for you. I honestly had to re-look up the plot of this movie before filming this segment because it just left my brain. And, sometimes I feel like these movies down here are more memorable just because they have aspects that are so god awful about them that a boring movie is sometimes just more forgettable. But it's by no means just a bad movie, but yeah, I just didn't care for it, and I'm going to throw it in the below average category. Next is another biopic, and this time it's Gandhi. The film follows the life of Mahatma Gandhi and his quest for India to gain its independence from Britain through non-violent means. I think the highlight of this movie is Ben Kingsley's performance as Gandhi. I truly bought into his performance as Gandhi, and he portrays him so well. When I think of Gandhi, this performance honestly pops in my mind, and it's just because he fully adapts his mannerisms and just truly looks like him. I also was just invested in the story. I think Gandhi is one of the most interesting human beings to ever live, and I just really like how the back and forth aspects of him against people that were close to him play out. Kind of just how he wants to continue this fight against Britain through just kind of standing strong, putting up with it when other people are constantly telling him, we need to fight back, we need some, like bloodshed, we need a big stance. And I think that back and forth aspect is just really, really interesting. In that scene where Britain pulls up and just mows down hundreds of innocent civilians is just a cinematic experience that is stuck in my mind. The movie is over 3 hours long, and I will say this is a movie where I much enjoyed the first half than the second half. I think it just kind of slowly loses steam throughout. I don't know if that was just kind of me seeing the repetitiveness of the second half kind of get to me. There's a large chunk of this film where Gandhi does something, he goes to prison for it, he gets out, and kind of rinse and repeat, even though each aspect adds a little bit more to the message he was pushing for. It's kind of the same thing over and over again when you're watching it in a film. With that being said, this is definitely a watchable biopic. It's not one that I'm going to revisit over and over again, but I do truly enjoy it. I'm going to put Gandhi in the good category. Next is Jack Nicholson and Shirley MacLaine's return to a Best Picture winner, Terms of Endearment. The film follows an adult daughter and mother and their struggles with their relationships. The mother is single and just kind of struggling to find true love, and the daughter is having marital issues states away. It seems like family dramas became more prevalent in the 70s and 80s, and this is no different. This movie is truly just a mother and daughter trying to connect and just get through life and find happiness, and I think it really is a great family drama. Shirley MacLaine, Deborah Winger, Jeff Daniels, and Jack Nicholson as kind of the four main titular characters throughout are truly great, and they do a great job portraying different relationship situations that many real life people can find themselves in. And I just really found this movie to be raw and real, and that kept me truly invested in the movie. I think I would put a lot of the emotional aspects in this movie on par with Kramer versus Kramer. And speaking of emotional aspects, this movie is a true tearjerker by the end. Once again, I don't like talking about spoilers on in these videos, but this movie is very, very heavy by the end of it. But I think the movie at its core, it's very simple, very easy to watch, very easy to consume. I think many, many people would enjoy this movie. In my opinion, this is like your titular mom or grandma movie. I think you could watch this with, your favorite woman in your life and they would absolutely adore this movie. And that's not to say men won't either, because I truly like this movie, but this just feels like a movie that moms would absolutely love. And I have to say, I really enjoyed it as well, and I'm going to put Terms of Endearment up here in the great category. Next is Milos Forman's second Best Picture winner, Amadeus. The movie is a fictionalized retelling of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's life through his bitter rival Antonio Salieri's eyes in a mental institution many years after his death. Now, I said this was a fictionalized biopic, and that's mostly because a lot of this story isn't true, mainly that Salieri wasn't Amadeus's rival in real life. They were actually frequent collaborators and got along pretty well according to most records. With that being said, this is a fantastic rivalry story. I mean, F. Murray Abraham's performance of Salieri is truly phenomenal. That the scenes of him sitting in his wheelchair in the mental asylum is just something that sticks in your mind and is definitely one of my favorite performances from this decade. Tom Hulce as Amadeus Mozart gives a fantastic performance as well. He's pretty much the perfect counterpart to the bitter Salieri. He's very loud and brash and wearing bright colors and has that obnoxious laugh that we hear multiple times throughout the movie. And I think that's what makes this movie so good, is that these two main characters are like the perfect rivals. And even though it's not really a rivalry when you're watching it either, because Amadeus doesn't even fully understand that Salieri hates him, which kind of gives the movie an interesting twist as well. But beyond the characters, this movie just looks outstanding. It has some of the best costumes I have seen in a Best Picture winner. Some of the best wigs, obviously, because that's what everyone wore back in that time. But then as well, the production design of this movie is out of this world. Many of the scenes are filmed with pure candlelight, and there's amazing scenes where Amadeus is performing and conducting, his music in his plays, and the chandeliers hanging above him have hundreds of candles on them. And I can't imagine how much time and energy and how many candles they went through on set in this movie. It's truly one of those films you watch and it is just absolutely mind-boggling. This is a true spectacle from beginning to end. I will say this is my second time watching this movie, and I rented it on Amazon, and all they had was the extended director's cut that made the film over 3 hours long. I feel like when I originally watched this movie a handful of years ago, it wasn't that long and I enjoyed the movie a lot more. And I have to say, this one was just kind of way too long. It definitely had some scenes that I felt could be cut out. And I just can't remember, but I feel like those are moments that I don't recall when I first initially watched this movie. I'm going to rank this based off of the director's cut that I watched, and I am going to throw it up next to the previous movie we talked about, Terms of Endearment. But if I'm able to get my hands on the theatrical cut, I could easily see this film jumping up into the amazing category. 1985 brought us, you guessed it, another biopic with Out of Africa. The movie follows Danish author Karen Blixen and the time she spent in Africa in the early 20th century. When I watch a biopic, I obviously want to, enjoy the film, but the main thing I want to take away is I want to be interested in the main character. I want the movie to end and I want to feel the urge to Google this person, go on their Wikipedia page and just read up more about their life. This film does not do that at all. There is nothing in this film that makes me interested in Karen Blixen as a person or want to know more about her or her other books that she wrote. What this movie kind of comes across as is entitled Rich White Lady Moving to Africa with her husband and just kind of facing relationship issues and just enjoying living in Africa until that kind of part of her life ultimately ended and she had to move back to her hometown. Meryl Streep does her best in this movie. It is a great performance. Meryl Streep is always going to deliver her top-notch best effort in a movie, but that just does not do enough to save this film in my opinion. And the different love interests she has throughout this movie just didn't pull my interest at all either. There's also some horrendous green screen in this movie, particularly in the beginning before they go to Africa. If you watch this movie, it is the most obvious thing you will ever see in your life, and I was like, how did that even make it? I understand that green screen technology probably was what it is today back then, but I just don't get how that made it into the final cut of the movie. What I will say about this movie is it looks outstanding. There are some fantastic shots of, Africa's ecosystem and wildlife. The animal shots in this movie are fantastic, and there are some great interactions with the wildlife throughout that I truly enjoyed. It's a movie that is a really, really great spectacle that I think kind of calls back to winners of previous decades from that aspect, filmmaking aspect side of things. But overall, this story is nothing to write home about. It's overly long. It's boring. I don't know how this won Best Picture, if I'm being honest, and I'm going to throw Out of Africa down here in the below average category. 1986 brought us Oliver Stone's Platoon. The movie follows a young man who signs up for the Vietnam War and writes home to his grandmother about the horrors and atrocities he's facing in Vietnam. When I think of war movies, this is kind of one that instantly pops into my mind. It's just extremely well done, hits all the beats you think a war movie will, and just truly displays how horrific it can be in battle. This movie is extremely brutal. There's many scenes of graphic violence. You're seeing limbs, you're seeing blood, you're just seeing kind of like the sweaty, gross nature of just even living in those elements outside of the war factor. I think what I really like about this movie is that it displays multiple channels of internal battles people face in war. Obviously, you have the enemies coming in on you. That's typical for war movies. But here we can really see the mental aspects come into play. We can see when people turn on each other even though they're fighting on the same side, in the same platoon, those type of things. And I think that's a really interesting element that we don't see in every single war movie, and I think it's extremely well done here. I think all of the performances in this movie are really great. Charlie Sheen is great in the lead, but I absolutely love Willem Dafoe in this movie. He's definitely the most memorable character, and kind of how his character ends up in this movie is one of the most memorable elements of the film. This movie can be truly haunting at times for a multitude of reasons, even outside of the war factor. And, just at the end of the day, if someone wants to watch a movie about the Vietnam War, this is definitely one that's in the upper echelon and is just a fantastic portrayal of that war. I am going to put Platoon up in the up in the great category. Up next is another biopic, this time The Last Emperor. The movie follows Pu Yi, who is the last emperor of China and took over when he was 2 years old. Now, this movie looks fantastic from beginning to end. The most interesting element about this movie is it was the first English-made film that was granted the rights to film inside the Forbidden City, which is where Pu Yi had his final reign. I think another interesting aspect about this movie is that it feels like it's something that would have taken place a long time ago, but ultimately a lot of this unfolded, around 100 years ago, which is just so interesting to think about. You don't think about emperors and people having this big reign over an entire country within the last, millennium. The Forbidden City just creates such a wonderful, immersive atmosphere, and it really takes you back to when, China had these emperors that would rule for, decades upon decades. And I absolutely love that historical aspect of this movie. I do think the movie is overly long and slows down to an absolute crawl once Pu Yi grows up and he's kind of shunned out of China and kind of retreats to Japan, where he's kind of used like a puppet by the Japanese government. Kind of that political aspect wasn't something I'm too personally invested in, and I was more, enjoying him ruling over the Forbidden City. So this movie isn't poorly made. It really looks great from beginning to end. It's well acted, but I just didn't really care about the historical aspects in the latter half of the film. For that alone, for me personally, I'm going to put it down here in the average category. But if you're really, really interested in China's history, overall, or just about their emperors, this is a very, very watchable film. Great performances, and it is just filled with history throughout, just due to its visuals. 1988 brought us Rain Man. The movie follows a selfish businessman who travels to his hometown after his estranged father's death. Upon returning, he finds out he did not inherit his father's fortune, but instead went to his brother he didn't know existed who has autism. Now, I have to say, I really, really enjoyed this movie. It follows your typical kind of road trip movie beats, due to the fact that Tom Cruise, who plays kind of the selfish businessman, basically kidnaps his brother because he wants to figure out a way to take that fortune away from his brother, played by Dustin Hoffman. And this movie is a fantastic kind of view of America as a whole. You get to see wide open fields, abandoned gas stations, you get to see Las Vegas. And I think it really truly captures how it feels to drive across America, which is something that hasn't truly been explored in any of these Best Picture winners so far, surprisingly. I think Tom Cruise gives a fantastic performance in this movie. He's truly kind of like this douchey guy. You understand where he's coming from, you understand his struggles, so you sympathize with him, but you're never truly rooting for him either. And Dustin Hoffman gives a performance that could have aged very poorly or just been, absolutely horrific out the gate. But I think it's handled with care, and it's truly one of those kind of characters that you just absolutely instantly click with, you instantly feel for, and you just kind of want the best outcome for him. This movie from start to finish is just kind of one of those that hit you right in the feels, and you're kind of rooting for that happy ending throughout the entire film. You ultimately get that happy ending. I don't think that's a shock or a spoiler. Kind of where the movie starts, you can kind of tell where it's going to go. It's a little bit predictable from that aspect, but for just kind of a heartwarming film, this is exactly what I want, and I truly enjoyed every single second of this movie. I haven't seen it before, but this is one I'm definitely going to revisit in the future, and I'm very pleased with this Best Picture winner. And I am going to put the Rain Man up in the great category. And to end this episode, we have 1989's Driving Miss Daisy. The movie follows an old white lady who crashes her car and can no longer drive. Her son hires her a black chauffeur, and she absolutely does not like it. I have to say, this is the most average Best Picture winner I've seen so far. I'm just right down the middle on it. I think Miss Daisy is a prejudiced old woman, even though the film tries to display her not in that manner. I think the direction is very bland and uninspiring, and I think the character growth throughout this movie is fairly pathetic. On the other hand, I think Morgan Freeman gives a fantastic performance. I think Hans Zimmer's score is great, and I also enjoy that the movie is around 90 minutes long, so that runtime does really breeze by, and it doesn't hit that, long, dragging aspect some of these 3-hour long biopic and other types of movies do. I just don't really have a whole lot to say about this movie. I think the race relations aspect it's trying to explore is kind of lame and not that deep. I think In the Heat of the Night right here that came out decades prior does that better. And I just really don't understand how this movie won Best Picture. It feels like a movie that would be on the Hallmark channel. It's just kind of slightly heartwarming. The story isn't all that interesting or inspiring or anything. It's just a very, very strange pick for Best Picture in my opinion. And like I said, I don't hate the movie. I just don't like it either. It's just the most average movie experience ever. It's exactly what you'd expect. An old white lady doesn't really like this old black guy, but then they somehow he likes her from the beginning, but she hates him, but she's like, "Oh, maybe I'll like him a little bit. Maybe I'll put my differences aside. Maybe I'm not racist," even though she clearly is multiple points throughout this entire film. I don't know. Not for me. It's definitely watchable, but I'm going to throw Driving Miss Daisy at the bottom of the average category, as it's like a perfect, right down the middle 50% movie. Now it's time to hand out my personal Oscars for the 70s and 80s. In supporting actress, I'm giving that to Meryl Streep in Kramer vs. Kramer. By far my favorite supporting performance out of these 2 decades. I absolutely adore her in this movie, and she's also fantastic in the other movies she shows up in as well, The Deer Hunter and Out of Africa. So it's just really hard to deny her greatness and how much she means to the Oscars and how fantastic she is in Kramer vs. Kramer. For supporting actor, I went with Robert De Niro in The Godfather Part 2, and I guess alongside this I can talk about Marlon Brando in The Godfather Part 1 in lead actor. I guess you can kind of argue that Marlon Brando's supporting in The Godfather Part 1, but the Oscars gave him the award back in the 70s and lead actor, so I went with that as well. But Don Vito Corleone is my favorite character out of these 2 decades by far, and I just love both of these portrayals as him. That backstory in Godfather Part 2 is my favorite aspect of that movie, and I absolutely love every single second of it, and De Niro is perfection. Same with Brando. I think Brando is the best performance out of these 2 decades, hands down. If I did have to stick Brando in supporting, I probably would have went with Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But it's hard to deny the greatness that is Vito Corleone in these 2 performances. Then sandwiched between them, I have lead actress. I went with Shirley MacLaine in terms of endearment. I just love her and Jack Nicholson's back and forth in that film. And Shirley MacLaine gave one of my favorite performances in The Apartment as well. So for her to give two fantastic performances that I love in Best Picture winners, I feel like I had to go with her here. In screenplay, I went with Kramer versus Kramer, and that once again kind of goes hand in hand with the Meryl Streep pick and my Best Picture pick. I think this is one of the best, American divorce relationship type of movies I've ever seen, and it's just a movie that I want to revisit over and over again. So Kramer versus Kramer is hands down my favorite film out of the 70s and 80s. And then director, maybe a little bit of a surprise pick. I went with Milos Forman for Amadeus. I think Francis Ford Coppola would probably be most people's pick here. But what I kind of went back and forth with is what would I rather double feature again from these two decades? Amadeus and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or The Godfather 1 and 2? And I think that answer is easily One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Amadeus for me personally, especially if I can find that theatrical cut version for Amadeus. Alongside that, Amadeus has hands down my favorite production design and just some beautiful, amazing shots throughout the film. And I think it is just a near perfect film from beginning to end. And just, I think the wide array of stories that Milos Forman presented here, Amadeus and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, are two drastically different movies, and he did such a fantastic job with both of them that I wanted to award him here. Well, there you have it. My Oscar Best Picture rankings and thoughts up through 1989. Make sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel, as the 90s and 2000s video will be on its way very soon. Also, make sure to check out some of the other videos on my channels as I cover the Oscar race and just post other in-depth movie analysis reviews. I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Have a good one, everybody.